kind of a nondescript piece of paper. And I guess that's about it. So I guess we'll get started, right? So first I'd like to welcome Mark Player. Thank you very much for coming here. We've traveled all the way from England, right, to visit, and this has a very busy research schedule while he's here. So we're very grateful to have you here in Nagoya and really appreciate your coming. I think some of you, through your conversations with me, we're circulating his book around. You may be familiar with Mark's work in East Asian cinema. He's working in particular with Japanese amateur films, or Kishiega, 8mm films, and sort of culture of amateur filmmaking. He also has related research interest in cyberpunk. That was sort of an early research interest for you, and currently you're also working on a Kyushu-based television, or I guess television,
amateur filmmaker.
Amateur filmmaker.
But he had links with TV.
With TV, yeah. So he has very wide, sort of expansive interests, and he's a great speaker. We first met this past spring at a conference on amateur media, and I was really impressed by his work, and the more I read about it, what he's done, I was just really eager to invite him here, so we're really grateful to have you. So the title of your talk, Japanese Cinema and Punk, Live in Nagoya. I think we'll get started. Is there enough seats? There's a seat. If you're not shy about sitting up in the front next to me, you're welcome here. It's the uncool seat, sitting next to the teacher. But yeah, if there's no further, I guess we've got all the pleasantries out of the way, so I guess we'll get started. So yeah, Mark, take it away.
Do I need to wait for the bell?
I guess we should, yeah, just as a formality. It's not allowed to start until the bell ends. Yes. That's it. Yeah.
Hello everyone. Thanks for coming out. Thank you to Dylan for inviting me to come to Nagoya and speak today. Thank you to the School of Humanities. Thank you to the Media, Culture and Society program. I wasn't sure when I was preparing my notes. I wasn't sure who had. There we go. I wasn't sure who made this fly, but it turned out to be Dylan. So I was going to thank whoever it was that made it. Because this is, very. Because when I had my book, Japanese Cinema and Punk, looks like this. When they were asking me, what would you like for a cover design, I kind of wanted something that was more like this. And I gave them lots of like links to like this, and then I ended up with something that looks a bit more like this. I like this as well, but I was hoping for something more like that. No, I'm going the wrong way. Oh, that's why it wasn't working. Yeah, so this is kind of it's partly a kind of a sort of a launch for the book, I suppose. So yeah, Japanese Cinema and Punk, published in May. So the book is kind of about how Japanese filmmakers engaged with punk, including its music subculture and broader do-it-yourself or DIY ethos in the 1980s, but also how filmmakers were kind of leveraging punk to create kind of intermedial film aesthetics and screenings that were influenced by other media, like rock music, graffiti painting, street performance, animation, all kinds of stuff. But also, most importantly, what do these what I call intermediate exchanges say about Japan's punku seidai, punk generation, throughout the 1980s? I should point out the slides are bilingual. I've tried to include as much Japanese as possible. I wasn't sure whether it's my first time presenting research on Japan in Japan, so toto kawaii. But so I wasn't sure of the experience level. I knew there was going to be obviously university people, but people outside the university as well. So I've tried to include as much Japanese as I can on the slides. My Japanese is very hitter, so it might not completely make sense, but if you need Japanese, it's there, and hopefully it's enough for you to kind of follow along with what I'm talking about. Also, I wasn't entirely sure about like the scope of the talk. I've decided to go for kind of like an overview, there is some theory, there's a little bit of theory, but not too much. I know some of you, if you're kind of researchers that are more theory orientated, if you're interested in more of the theoretical dimensions of the work and how I'm using theory to engage with these things, we can talk about that afterwards. But I thought today would be more of a kind of a fun, showing you lots of kind of cool stuff and like what I've been working on for the last sort of few years. So to set the mood, I was going to show you a clip. It's the trailer for a film called Bakuretsu Toshi, or Burst City. Has anyone seen this? Anyone familiar? Yeah, hand at the back. A man of culture. So it also it's very representative, I guess, of what we kind of think of as like Japanese films that kind of engage with punk. So yeah, it's about 90 seconds, so I'll let it speak for itself. Yeah, so I love this film. It's an absolute mess, but I love it. It's very like loud, anarchic, youthful. It's kind of punks fighting the system kind of thing. So it's great. But before I get too ahead of myself, this is kind of a rough map of the talk today. It's kind of in two parts. So part one is basically kind of an overview of the book, Japanese Cinema Punk, and the kind of things I'm talking about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how punk emerged in Japan. I'm going to talk a little bit about how filmmakers in Japan were starting to engage with punk culture and what that looked like, and also intermediate approaches to Japanese cinema and punk. There are 4 big cases in the book. I'm probably not going to have time to talk about them all in depth, but I want to try and give you, I guess, a little bit of a taste of how I'm sort of trying to approach and engage with these films. And then I'm going to move on to part 2, which is about a local Jishu Eiga DIY film group that operated in Nagoya called Rolling Film in Nagoya in the early 1980s. So I'm going to introduce that group a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of their films and some of the controversies around the films. And then there's going to be, at the end, a short film screening of a film called Crazy Dolls, which is sort of playing here in the corner. Sort of a punk film, involved members of local punk bands at the time. I have some more people to thank for this, so I need to thank Suzuki Akihiro of the Underground Cinema Festival, who is kindly given me a file of the film to play. Also, Watanabe Machiko-san, who is the star of the film. She pops up occasionally in this little kind of little reel here. There she is. So hopefully at the end of all this, there will be a little bit of time for kind of questions and stuff. I'm happy to talk about any of this, although seeing as Watanabe's here, if anyone has any questions about the film, I'm kind of curious to kind of get what, I only saw it for the first time a few days ago, because it was something that it was very difficult to get hold of, and I had to kind of email lots of people, and there's a lot of begging involved for me to be able to kind of track it down. So I'm kind of curious to see what people in the room think about it and how it might fit in with some of the broader topics that I'm going to be sort of talking about in this kind of overview. So when Dylan invited me to come over to Nagoya to talk, I was very excited about it because Nagoya is widely considered to be the birthplace of Japanese punk rock. It's a band called the Star Club. They formed in April 1977 by the founder was Hikage, who's this little gentleman here. They took their name. They're one of the first bands in Japan to kind of play, I guess, what we would kind of think of as punk rock to our ears. There are precursors to this band like Gedo, and there's some other bands that were playing a kind of like a stripped down sort of, I guess, blues rock, but like a Stooges kind of like proto punk kind of. Those kind of bands were kind of around in Japan, but sort of Star Club is kind of one of the first to kind of tip it over into more of a punk sound. They took their name from the Star Club, which is a famous music venue in Germany in 1960. So the Beatles played here before they were famous. Jimi Hendrix Experience, Ray Charles, loads of kind of famous acts there. So they took their name from Germany, but of course they took their sound from the punk rock that was starting to kind of seep into Japanese pop culture. So you had things like the debut albums of seminal bands like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols. They were getting Japanese LPs within like months of their UK and US counterparts, and you can kind of see here. I should have mentioned the Star Club is still going, by the way. They're still touring and performing. Hikage's the only original member. They've had like lots of other people playing with them over the years, but yeah, just 2 years ago, in an interview, he's kind of talking about how like hearing these bands kind of inspired him to form his own band. It's kind of a cross between like the sound of the Ramones and like the vocal style of the Sex Pistols. Map of Japan, of course. So we have the Star Club in Nagoya, so 1977. But as punk grew in popularity over time, other bands are starting to spring up in other areas, and you're starting to get more larger kind of punk scenes starting to develop. So, for example, in Tokyo, you had what was called the Tokyo Rockers. So bands like S-Ken, 8.5, Friction, Lizard, Speed. This is very much inspired by like the New York scene, like CBGB's, Max's Kansas City, those type, like the bands playing there, so Ramones, Talking Heads, Blondie, those types of bands, because some of the musicians, like the bassist from Friction, the vocalist from X-Ken, they had been to New York and seen those bands firsthand, and they were like, oh, we want to create something like this for ourselves in Japan when we come back. You also had nearby, you had what was referred to as the Kansai No Wave. It takes its name from No Wave. Again, it's like an American import. So bands like Aunt Sally, Inu, the SS, and Ultra Bide. This was kind of a looser scene, mostly split between Osaka and Kyoto. And also the sound is kind of looser as well. So the SS is a very cacophonous, early hardcore punk sound, whereas like Inu's more of a nimble, bouncy post-punk kind of band. And then finally, the next sort of major kind of scene to emerge was known as Mentai Rock, or also Hakata no Roku as well. So this is based in Fukuoka. So bands like ARB, the Mods, the Rockers, the Roosters, Shin and Rockettes. So they kind of were an interesting blend, a little bit of punk, a little bit of new wave, a little bit of 50s American rock and roll, because there were sort of naval bases in Fukuoka, so they again, very America inspired. Interestingly, the Mentai rock bands consider themselves distinct from the punk bands, but because they kind of both emerged around, both punk and Mentai rock emerged around the same time in the late 70s, they kind of get conflated a lot, both in the public imagination and also I think film has actually played, as I'll explain a bit later, I think film has played a big role in that kind of conflation. So bands from both scenes will appear in the same film, the music will be used kind of interchangeably. So I think so these kind of four areas formed the backbone of then what became known as Indizu Ongaku, like Indies music. So, and that was much broader than not just punk, but a lot of music genres, but their shared characteristic was that they were kind of operating outside of the music industry. One of the reasons they were able to do that was the advent of venues called live houses or robo house. So there was a big boom of live houses kind of around the mid 70s. Before that, there weren't as many venues that were dedicated to kind of amplified rock music in Japan. You had like town halls and you had bigger venues, but then for a small indie band, they were kind of either not appropriate or not accessible So this was kind of like a very important lifehouse, certainly for punk music, Shinjuku Loft. These photos are from the original venue. It's, I think in the late 90s it moved to its current location in Tokyo. It's sort of nearby, it's still in kind of, still in Shinjuku, but it's like a much bigger venue, like multiple rooms, they can sort of do a lot more. But the original venue was just like, a room, bar at one stage at the other, very small, very like sweaty and cramped and kind of very personal, and that's how a lot of the early seminal punk shows kind of happened here. It's certainly in Tokyo. Nagoya, of course, has its own equivalent. Electric Ladyland opened just a year later in 1977. This photo is of the current venue. This is in Osu. The original venue was kind of around the corner on Osudori. Again, that was a smaller venue, and then around 99, 2000, big venue, like multiple rooms, so it can host sort of multiple events. A fun way to kind of start to map, and also, Star Club played here, forgot to mention, and also bands from out of town for other cities. If they were playing in Nagoya, they most likely would play here. A fun way to kind of find out what bands are playing with who and in what venues is to study Chirishi. There's a great, I highly recommend this book. It's called Chirishi, Tokyo Punk and New Wave, 1780s. It's a large format image book. It's basically just mostly filled with flyers, but it's a really fun kind of visual history of how punk kind of evolved. Again, it's mostly focused on Tokyo, but then there are flyers from other cities as well. When bands from Tokyo would play other cities, they kind of collected some of those. So again, this is a very seminal early punk event, Punk Machine 99%, at a venue called S-Ken Studio, which is in Roppongi in Japan. There's S-Ken, a studio, there's also a band called S-Ken, and there is a musician there's a guy called S-Ken, and then he started the band, and then I'll start a studio as well. So there are technically 3 S-Kens. This is the S-Ken, this is the studio. That's May 1978. As you start looking through this, you also start to notice, this is Tokyo Rockers bands in Kyoto. So this is, we jumped forward to October 1978. You'll kind of see here that there was a film screening involved. So this is a New York punk documentary, Kansai first screening. You can't really make it out here, but the katakana are bands. You've got Talking Heads there. I think that's Blondie. It's a bit difficult to make out, but I have a clearer version in the next slide. So this is another event. This is again at S-Ken, sort of Christmas punk show, and they showed London film. It's not entirely clear what they mean by that. There were films. Something you'll notice is that the flyers, they will list the bands that appear in the films rather than name the films, so it makes it difficult to determine what kind of footage you'll be talking about. There were films being made, of course, in London. You had the punk rock movie, also known as the punk rock movie from England, when it circulated overseas. It was an 8mm documentary about punk. A lot of the bands in this film appear on this list, but some of them don't. So did they show that, and then did they show other footage? So it's not entirely clear. But it was something. It's something interesting to note how film did play a kind of a role in Japan's understanding of punk rock, because obviously they had the music. They also had magazines starting to cover punk, like Dole and Takarajima and Fool's Mate. There were some seminal magazines in the early 80s that were kind of writing articles and showing photos of punk. So you had the sound and the image were separate, but film would bring those things together. So of course it was only a matter of time before Japanese filmmakers started making films about their own scenes. So this is again, this is a very Tokyo kind of specific thing. So we've got 3 films here that kind of cover how punk was evolving from the late 70s to the early 80s. So first film is Rockers by Tsushima Hideaki. So this is, again, these are all independently made films. So this is about like the Tokyo Rockers scene. That's 8½, performing there. The middle film is a film called Not Satisfied by Ota Tatsuya. It's about a band called Anarchy, who, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Anarchy. They were kind of one of the first, I guess you could describe, commercially successful punk bands in Japan. Their first album sold about 100,000 copies, which is a big deal for a punk band, but it's also generally a big deal for rock music in Japan because rock music in the early 80s was still relatively niche. When you get to the mid to late 80s, you had what was called the band boom, and that's when rock music kind of becomes like a major music genre in Japan, certainly from a commercial perspective. And then finally we have, that's shot on 8mm by the way, and then finally we have Choto no Ame Gaman, yeah, Never Mind a Little Rain by Yoshida Junji, and this kind of captures, it was shot over a year from 1982 to 83, and it kind of captures the early hardcore punk scenes of bands like GISM, The Execute, The Comes, Gauze, a lot of bands there, and again, mostly concert footage, performance footage mixed in with kind of interviews. Not Satisfied is unique in that it's more of a kind of just following the band around, so there's performance, but there's also them just hanging out backstage and also touring. It's also quite interesting, at the end of the film, the band goes to London to record music for a film, but because Oto was he was a high schooler when he made this, he was a 17-year-old fan of the band and was just following around with his camera, but he wasn't allowed to go to London, so the band borrow his camera and continue shooting the film for him. So while this is all going, this is late 70s, early 80s, you had a boom in what was called, just a general boom in Jishueiga. So, brief kind of definition of what Jishueiga is. So a mode of DIY filmmaking that is self-financed and self-produced outside of the film industry, often by filmmakers with no formal training. Films are often made using small gauge film or video cameras and are typically screened in non-commercial venues. But although those lines start to get, as we go deeper into the 80s, those lines start to get very blurred, but at least in the 70s, that was kind of what was going on. The film playing is Kokotai Paniku, Panic High School, by Ishisogo, who is a recurring name in this talk. So this is a little bit before he was very involved in the punk scene and made loads of films with punks, but this is just before that happened, but you can already see there's a bit of an anti-authoritarian spark. So it's a short film. High school student is basically fed up of studying maths, so he turns up to school with a gun and shoots his teacher, and then this leads to a kind of a standoff. So this is kind of near the start of the film, and this is sort of a standoff at the end. He's taken some students hostage. This got remade into a studio feature 2 years later, so it kind of shows you how, and Ishii was kind of signed on as a co-director, although he kind of he disowns the film because he felt that the studio just took it away from him. But you can kind of see this is around the time when Jishueiga is kind of in ascendancy and is starting to have a major kind of cultural impact in Japanese film culture. I'm just talking without my note. I'm just sort of freestyling at the moment. Let me just make sure I'm not. Yeah, so because what was unique about Panic High School is that it was kind of emulating studio kind of film, so making like a low-budget action film rather than a more kind of insular, kind of introverted type of filmmaking. And then the studios then started to see the commercial potential in these films. So it's kind of interesting that when remaking the film at studio, this is the short Jishueiga to studio feature film. It's a little bit like how a record label would find a band, pluck them out of obscurity, and then re-record their demos as like a debut studio album or something like that. But Jishueiga can be quite a broad subject. My colleague Jasper Sharp says that self-made films, they can include works made at high school or university, but they can also include like home movies, video diaries. Most experimental cinema technically falls under Jishueiga because it's made outside of industry parameters. Political documentaries, like handmade animations. So it's a very, very broad topic, and punk is just a very small. It's worth pointing out that punk is a very small slice of that. Factors of the boom. I'm not going to have time to go through each of these in turn, but Jishueiga basically the history of it goes back all the way back to like the 1920s when small gauge cameras were like 9.5mm, and when small gauge cameras were starting to kind of be introduced to Japan. But there was a massive boom of it mid to late 70s. It just sort of skyrockets in popularity, particularly among high school and university age students. Some of the reasons for that is that there were reduced opportunities in the industry. typically like all your like your classic film directors, you know, Kurosawa Akira, Yasujiro Ozu, Mizoguchi Kenji. Those filmmakers, when they entered the industry, they entered as apprentices, and they'd get assigned to like an assistant director, and then over several years they'd work their way up to the role of director, and then when the studio felt they were ready, they can then start directing their own films. By the mid-70s, that process had completely disappeared, or almost virtually. There was a couple of studios still left that were still doing it, and so a way for new filmmakers who wanted to sort of gain experience was just to, well, I'll just make my own films then, rather than go to a studio. New sync sound Super 8 film cameras entered the market, 1973, 1974. That meant that you can now start shooting dialogue films a lot more easily. So you could just plug your microphone directly into the camera via kind of XLR, rather than trying to record the audio separately and trying to post syncing 8mm is a bit of a hassle. There's a big increase in school and university film clubs. So Kokodai Panuku was made by a group called Kyoeisha, like crazy film group. So they were kind of like one of these kind of school/university film groups, and there were loads of Rolling Film in Nagoya was also one of these types of groups as well. So again, formed by university students, and they just they get together, shared interests, and they start making films. And they help each other out with their films as well. So you kind of get this sort of cottage industry of self-reliant kind of filmmaking, and also that then led to kind of jishu joy, self-screening. So filmmakers would organise their own screenings. A way that they are able to do that was to make use of entertainment listings magazines that were also starting to become more popular in the 1970s. So you had a Peer magazine for Tokyo. So this told you about, you know, films, theatre, live music. In Britain, for example, in London, we have a magazine called Time Out. I think there's a Time Out Japan as well. So it's basically that. It just kind of gives you, it's purely information. It just gives you listings of what's playing where and for how long for and what the price is, and here's a phone number for the cinema and all that kind of stuff. Nagoya had its own version of this called the Nagoya Playguide Journal. It didn't last as long. It sort of 1972 to 1982. And most major cities had a magazine like this, and they often let you advertise your stuff for free. So for Jishueiga, you could just submit your screening to the magazine, and they'd pop it in the next issue, or, you know, the issue that's appropriate. And then finally, Peer magazine decided, you know, there's so much Jishueiga now happening. They decided to launch their own film festival to kind of start screening some of it. So the Peer Film Festival began in 1977. And it still runs today. So every year, Jishueiga sort of independent film kind of competition. So Peer is a very big supporter of this kind of film. But also it has led to some conflation. So in 2016, the festival put together a program, digitized a bunch of these Jishueiga, because again, most of them are shot on 8mm, put together a bunch of them and called it Hachimiri Madness, Japanese independence from the punk years. But this has also led a little bit, and I see talk in like online spaces and film spaces, people tend to conflate Jishueiga and punk films. I think this has partly played a role in it, and I've probably facilitated that myself to some degree over the years. I'm trying to be more nuanced now with how I talk about these things, but before I think I was shooting from the hip a bit too much. But so it's worth saying that it's interesting also that there are these booms happening at the same time. You have a boom in punk rock and a boom in Jishueiga. They're separate phenomena, but there are some shared circumstances that led to that, which I can't go into now, but maybe that can be a topic in the discussion. But it is worth mentioning that not all Jishueiga are punk films. Not all punk films are necessarily Jishueiga, because also the film industry, like similar to how the music industry took an interest in punk, the film industry also took an interest in punk as well. So you start to get these interesting independent industry kind of collaborations taking place, and I'll be talking about that a little bit in a minute. So films like Not Satisfied and Urban Mind Little Rain, they kind of qualify as Jishueiga because, again, they're self-initiated. No one told them to make these films. They wanted to do it because they loved the bands. They're self-funded, made by they were students at the time that made them, and also shot on 8mm. other Jishuega, as these are fictional, obviously the other two are documentary. Fictional Jishuega is also starting to kind of incorporate sort of punk stuff around this time. Saint Terrorism features a cameo from a band called Jagatara, who were not strictly a punk band. They swam in similar waters. They played a mix of like punk, new wave, funk, reggae. They're kind of a very interesting band. They're kind of like a Japanese Talking Heads, if you need like a sort of like a Western reference. And also Tokyo Cabbage Man K, Tokyo Hakusai Kankeisha. Thank you. And this has a Mentai rock soundtrack. So the band Sheena and the Rockettes, basically most of their second album is used as the soundtrack for this. I don't think the filmmaker had permission to do that, but he did it anyway. But you can also see how, again, yeah, Mentai rock is starting to kind of enter into the mix as well. As we go deeper into the 80s, we start to get more kind of complex collaborations starting to form. So in the top here, Geotropism. It's another film by Yasuda Junji. That's Sakevi from GISM. He passed away a couple of years ago. So I didn't get a chance to, I was hoping to have a talk with him at some point, but he passed away before I had a chance. Basically, Sakevi had visual ideas that he wanted to make a film about. So he told those ideas to Yasuda, and then Yasuda made, it's a very experimental film, like visually at least. And so, yeah, so that's kind of an example of a musician having an idea for a film, and getting a filmmaker to help them realise it. Bottom left, we have a film called Metal Days by Fukui Shojin. Involves, so again, narrative film, sort of a gang of punks played by members from two different bands. So you had one band called Crack and Zamarian, who went on, they were actually kind of semi-popular in the late 80s, they're kind of like pop punk kind of band. And you had another lesser known band called Rouser. The experience of making this film inspired Fukui to start his own punk band. He started a band called Hone, which were a positive punk band, which is sort of like a mix of punk and kind of goth rock and a bit more, yeah, a sort of new wavy kind of band. And then top left, you have a film called Naked 24 Hours by Morosawa Toshihiko. Again, this is a film where people in the punk scene have ideas for films, but they don't know how to make films, so they get one of their friends as a filmmaker, so they say, oh, make this film with us. That's Himuro Kyosuke, who became very famous just after this film was made. He was in a band called Bowie, huge like pop rock band in the mid to late 80s, very popular with the ladies. And so then a lot of his new fans then, they found out, oh, he's in this film, and so they would kind of seek it out, and then they kept screening the film to the point where the print, I was talking to Dylan over lunch about this earlier, that the print got destroyed. So this film is now what they call a Maboroshi no Ega, a phantom film. You can't see, this hasn't been screened since 1988, which is when the print broke. And then in the bottom right is the film we're going to be watching a little bit later, Crazy Dolls by Karagi Hirohisa, including Nagoya punk bands, The Star Club appear in this, another band called Oxydo. There's Watanabe there, just poking into frame there. You also have Nakamura Tatsuya, who was in a band. He was in Oxydo. He also played in the Star Club as well. So a lot of these musicians would play in each other's bands and help each other out. But we've also got commercial films starting to kind of take more commercial, commercial films, I suppose. So top left, Violent Warriors. So Ishitaro, who's better known for his kind of Eruguru and Nansenso films of the late 60s, like Horrors of Malformed Men and Shogun Joys of Torture and that sort of thing. But in the late 70s, he kind of did, it's kind of a rip-off of The Warriors, so an American film. We have like different themed gangs. So it's kind of Japan trying to cash in on that. And the film begins at like an open-air music festival, and ARB are kind of on stage performing. Bottom left, Bakuru Totoshi, you saw the trailer for earlier, and that includes like members of the Rockers and the Roosters from the Mentai scene, but also the Stalin, another kind of famous kind of punk band, members from Inu appear in it as well. Top left, Farewell Love, Rock is Sex, is a Pinku Ega, a pink film. Again, Ishibashi Ryo, vocalist of ARB, same guy. He's kind of he plays the lead in that, and he's kind of the vocalist of a punk band. And then you also have another film by Ishii. This is Burst City, also Ishii Sogo. And at the bottom you have Asia Strikes Back, which was actually made for the at the time there was a newly emerging original video market, like straight to video releases, and this was a 30-minute promotional film for a band called Bacillus Army, and Ishii was a member of the band for a while. He was the vocalist for a little while, and he made a film that's effectively there's Michael Jackson's Thriller. There's like a short, John Landis made a short film that it's kind of like that, but for this band. So a lot of their music, a lot of the band's music appear in it, and but also these are members of a band called Gauze. So you've got members of another band appearing. So Bacillus Army don't appear in the film, but their music is in the film. It's slightly confusing, but it is what it is. And so so then you have, of course, more original video stuff, mainly concert films. So again, a lot of these are directed by Ishii Sogo. So like The Stalin Last Live, Roosters Paranoid Live, The Star Club again, bit of Nagoya representation, Action Street. You also, this is a very interesting case, Video Stalin. So the Stalin broke up in 1985, but then Endo Michiro, so the leader of Stalin, decides I'm going to start a new band called Video Stalin, and I'm going to release our music on V8 rather than release it on CD or vinyl. I'm going to release it on VHS instead. So this is a release called Love Terrorist, and it's kind of a mix of concert footage, music video, off stage, band goofing around kind of footage. So it's kind of an interesting example of how musicians were starting to embrace emerging, new technologies to find new ways of kind of expressing their music. So so we have all these different kinds of films going on. We have 8mm self-made film, we have theatrically released films, we have Pinku Eiga, concert films, promo films. There's obviously music videos are being made at this time, which I haven't, as a whole other sphere that I haven't touched on. But we've also got a mix of short and feature-length films, we've got fiction, we have documentary experimental films, but we also have different interactions with punk going on. So we have punk and mentai rock songs being used in films, we have musicians appearing in the films, either as themselves or sometimes playing characters. We also have musicians having their own ideas for films and filmmakers helping with that. And we've also got filmmakers becoming musicians. So Fukui started the band, Ishii Sogo became a vocalist for Bacillus Army, for example. And we've also got different media at play. So we have film and music, of course, which are kind of the two main components of my study. But we've also got video and television, and again, another bunch of stuff that I haven't even begun to kind of explain to you yet. But things like animation and photography played a role, graffiti aesthetics, street performance and theatre, because a lot of Jishu Eiga would get local theatre actors to star in their films. So that was a way of kind of casting their films. So the question then becomes, how do we begin to kind of approach and navigate all these different different kinds of films, different kinds of media, different relationships and collaborations going on. So my solution was intermediality. So this is the boring theory part, so I apologise. So intermediality refers to the interaction and exchange between different kinds of media, such as film, music, art and performance, in the creation or reception of an artwork. It highlights how different media can intersect, overlap and transform one another to produce new meanings and experiences. And this felt it felt very appropriate for punk, because we have a few quotes here from different scholars, because punk is largely associated with music. It's not the only thing that punk is about, but we predominantly think of punk in musical terms. And so if we're thinking about films that are about punk or punk films, it kind of implied already off the bat, there's an intermedial relationship implied there. But also, as Jane Giles kind of says, it was more than just music. It's an eclectic, polymorphous, perverse movement that cross-referenced music, art, politics, clothes, and moving image. And also, this is Dick Hebdige, who, if you're studying subculture, very important early scholar in studying subculture and stuff, and he wrote quite a lot about punk in the late 70s. Because punk had what he calls a bricolage style. So bricolage is just grabbing anything that's kind of close to hand and kind of throwing, very DIY, very thrown together. And bricolage is capable of infinite extension because basic elements can be used in a variety of improvised combination. So aside from Celine Murillo's research, this is certainly the first book that looks at punk through an intermedial lens. And this is a journal article at the top. So it's a very emerging frontier, I suppose. No, I was kind of surprised no one's really kind of looked at it this way before, considering all the different kind of connections and stuff. And also with punk bricolage, it's most readily apparent in punk fashion. So bringing together different types of clothing, different hairstyles, safety pins. Also, the more provocative punks will do things like wear like Nazi armbands and things, and not necessarily because they believe the ideology, but more as a provocation to sort of shock. And also, it's a way of resisting commodification. It's very difficult to kind of, of course, they kind of failed at that, because you can go into like shops and buy this kind of stuff now. But at the time, that was their way of trying to resist being classified and having their style be co-opted by commerce, basically. So there are many ways that you can approach intermediality. My book looks at three things in particular. Again, not really going to have time to go into the theoretical underpinnings of each one, but we have practical, political, and phenomenological. So the practical, basically, what kinds of intermediality was taking place, what media was being put together with our media during the punk era, and how was that happening. Political, I don't necessarily mean in a kind of government policy voting kind of political, but more in terms of ideology, power, status, that kind of thing. And like, what did it mean for these filmmakers to do this, and what does that say about the environment that they're in? So my former PhD supervisor, Lucia Najib, coined an expression called intermedial passages, and she argues that intermediality can become a passage for us to access particular times and places, and like the political circumstances of a time and place. So in easy words, how different media is used says something about the era in which it was taking place. And phenomenology is the study of experience. So how did people experience these things at the time, and how do we experience them now? Because that is not always the same. So going back to the Naked 24 Hours example, we can't there is one way that you can experience that, and if I have time at the end, I'll sort of talk about it. I have a slide prepared for it, but I've removed it from the main deck. So these are my kind of four cases so each of these has a dedicated chapter. I talk about the film and also stuff going on around the film as well. So this was a kind of a way of, I was quite keen to kind of capture the entire span of the decade. So we start from the early 80s through to the early 90s. Different filmmakers, and how different filmmakers in different moments in time were engaging with this different media, and how they engage with punk as well, because different film, like Ishii and Fukui, for example, were, they were quite deeply embroiled in punk, whereas Yamamoto, he considers himself to not, I was talking with him the other day, and he gets very annoyed that I'm not punk, stop calling me punk. But he knew a lot of people, a lot of his friends were kind of punks, and obviously a lot of his films then reflect the punk scene, even though he felt he was kind of an outsider to it. And then Tsukamoto has very little connection to punk at all, but that's Tsukamoto there. But the other lead actor in the film was a vocalist in a punk band, so he has a bit of a way in sort of through that. So I guess I should probably explain what these films are for those who don't know. So Burst City, Bako Satoshi, saw the trailer earlier, big punk rock extravaganza made at the height of the popularity of punk in Japan, where it was pretty much mainstream at this point. Robinson no Niwa, Robinson's Garden, 1987, is about a kind of a young woman, kind of a delinquent sort of drug dealer. She finds an abandoned industrial kind of factory in the middle of Tokyo, and decides to start squatting there, and turns it into like a post-punk oasis, and all of her other delinquent friends start living there as well, but it all kind of like falls apart. These two, we start moving away from punk as a kind of as a subculture or as a community. these are more kind of like science fiction works. Some people describe these as cyberpunk, because there is kind of a through line there between punk and cyberpunk in Japan. So Tetsuo, probably the most famous of these films. I'm guessing some of you, I'm getting some nods. Yeah, getting some nods there. So Salaryman turns into a big scrap metal monster, and then there's another guy who's also turning into a scrap metal monster that wants revenge. And then Pinocchio 964 is, again, sort of in that sort of cyberpunk model. Fukui worked on Tetsuo as an assistant, and then he made his own film. So they're often talked about together because they are thematically, there's some similar themes going on. It's about a kind of lobotomized, it's a human man, it's Suzuki Haji, who was a vocalist in the band Rouser that I mentioned earlier. He is basically turned into like a cybernetic sex slave and is sold, but then the owner is very sexually demanding and he's not able to perform as expected, and then just gets dumped on the street, and he has no memory. And then a young woman who's also kind of homeless sort of takes him in. That's kind of the general gist of the film. So he's like his namesake in reverse. He's a human that becomes cybernetic rather than like a wooden puppet that becomes human. And something that's also interesting about these films is that it was an opportunity to look at intermediality in different specific kind of areas of filmmaking. So with Burr City, I kind of looked at aesthetics. In Robinson's Garden, I look at spaces. By spaces, I mean spaces that appear in the film, so like pro-filmic spaces. Tetsuo, it's kind of overlaps with aesthetics, but I was more keen on the actual production and the intermedial strategies that were going on at the moment of production that then results in the aesthetics. And then for Pinocchio 964, I was very interested in how the film was screened. It was screened in a very unique way in what was called Bakon Joe, explosive sound screening, where the director would turn up with big speaker stacks, custom PA, like effectors, and he was playing in mini theatres, and mini theatres in the 80s were kind of notorious for having kind of crap sound systems. So he would, I'll bring in my own sound system, and then so that was kind of how he got around that. So it's interesting how intermediality works as a method of compensation a lot of the time for these filmmakers, because they don't always have the resources that they want, so then they reach into other media and borrow elements or borrow strategies or techniques or creative personnel like musicians and theatre actors and so on. So what's my time? 3:30, okay. So I do have a little bit to say about each of the films. I'll try and speed run it, I suppose, because I also want to move on to the Rolling Film and the Gaia stuff, which is just after this. So with something that I found particularly interesting with studying Ishii in general, and this was kind of a quote that comes from Ogata Akira. So Ogata is the director of Tokyo Cabbage K, but he was also an assistant director. He worked with Ishii a lot. He was the assistant director of Burr City as well. And it was kind of a comment that he made in an interview that I thought was particularly interesting, because it kind of implies there's an intermedial relationship implied there right from the get-go. So I think there were two types of film director before Ishii. The type that reads a script and visualizes the text, and the type that visualizes using storyboards, like Kurosawa Akira. Ishii is neither. I think he's probably the first director in Japan to visualize sound, so oto o eizoka. This can be said, I think a lot of the directors that I'm studying, you could say that for them, but I think Ishii is kind of like the top dog, that kind of thing. And with Burr City, the visualization of sound occurs in different ways. So there's what I call overt and covert. So an example of overt is this scene. It's a scene at the start of the film. It's a musical number, because of course it is. The song is called Yufuku no Kiga, which is kind of a very tricky thing to translate, because it's kind of like a I've forgotten the word now. Oxymoron, yeah. So because you've got like Yufuku, you've got like luxury, abundance versus like starvation and famine. So the translation I went with in the book, and also just sort of based on the lyrics, is like suffering from abundance, because I think this is again a generation where they don't really have anything to complain about, because this is like early 80s Japan, where it's like very affluent economy. Yeah, there's politically quite stable, so there's not much for them to complain about, but they're going to complain anyway because they're young. So, yeah, so that's the end of that clip. So, yeah, so this is what is like theorists like Werner Wolf, for example, would describe as overt intermediality, where you have two things going on. You have obviously the moving image and the music. They're working together, but they remain distinct. So this is a song. The song exists independently of the image, but the image is working in concert. In concert with it. So yeah, image and music kind of remain sort of distinct. They are, I think Wolf uses the term quotable. So they are kind of separately quotable. An example of covert intermediality is this scene here. And it's kind of inspired by, again, this is from Tom Mez, who's written a lot about Ishii over the years. So Ishii knew the punk scene, knew the bands, and knew the personalities of the musicians. In fact, he was one of them. His instrument just happened to be a movie camera rather than a guitar or drum. So this idea of the camera being a musical instrument or trying to use it in a way that evokes what a musical instrument can produce. So obviously when we're talking about punk rock, we're talking about power chords, we're talking about like aggressive up-tempo rock music for the most part. And so finding a way, can the camera match that energy? Can the camera kind of try to emulate the kind of the ecstasy and the pleasure of that music, but visually rather than through sound. So.
今日何しようか。
So yeah, so that's that kind of idea of like the camera is like when the music kind of kicks up a notch, so does the camera work, and it obviously it then just sort of turns into, it deteriorates into abstract, or abstract nonsense basically. But again, it's trying to emulate that kind of the ecstasy of punk rock, especially that counterpart, the juxtaposition of before, where again you've got like a much more somber song playing, like a lower tempo song playing, and then that sort of spiky kind of guitar rock kind of then comes in. So yeah, again, a lot of filmmakers, when I've been talking to a lot of these filmmakers, they all kind of say similar things about, I wanted to try and do, I can't play music, so I thought, well, I know how a camera works, so I'll try and do the same thing, but with a camera instead of with a guitar or with a drum kit or bass or whatever. So that was kind of I noticed that was a recurring sentiment among the filmmakers. But of course, with Burst City, these processes are kind of complicated because the film, it doesn't look like it, but it was actually funded, it was actually studio funded. It was a company called Toei Central. Toei Central is a subsidiary of Toei, the big studio, and they were on the lookout for funding kind of promising independent filmmakers or buying independent films so that they can then release them theatrically. So Toei Central approached Ishii and said, we'll fund your next film for you, and sort of Burst City was the result. So you have a situation where you have a film that's trying to be like, the Burst City is often kind of regarded as like the ultimate or defining Japanese punk film, but it's obviously its relationship with the industry kind of complicates that idea, because you've got on the one hand, a punk film. Most of the crew for the film were people from the Jishuega scene. They're mostly like Ishii's friends from Jishuega. But then you had like studio money and also a studio deadline, which is one of the film is basically not complete. They didn't shoot about 60% of the script was shot, and the rest of it they didn't have time to shoot. And so they then had to just patch together whatever they could to make the film make sense. And also, it's being released in Japan at a time when media mix is sort of the strategy of the day. So media mix, for those who don't know, was films were no longer just films anymore. They had to be part of big transmedial promotional strategies. So you'd have like a soundtrack album, you'd have a book, there'd be TV appearances, there'd be radio promotions and stuff. So you had the Burst City soundtrack album, for example. You also had this Burst City Rock and Roll book, which is a book about the making of the film. There's a tie-in novel as well of Burst City because it was based on an earlier version of the script. This also happens to coincide when punk is sort of becoming a bit of a mainstream item. So here you have the Stalin performing on Music New Wave, which was broadcast by TV Saitama. This was about a week after Burst City was released in cinema, so this is very, very close together. There's Endo there, writhing on the floor. You can kind of tell that the audience just has absolutely no frame of reference. They just sat there very, very polite. They're very polite. At the end of the clip, they just sort of very politely clap, and then that's the end of the broadcast. So this is a time when punk bands are being picked up by major labels. So you've kind of got this tension between, on the one hand, they want to do their own thing, but labels are also kind of like, and studios in the case of filmmakers, kind of like knocking on the door, so to speak. And so how to sort of deal with that. So the next film, Robinson's Garden. So in Burst City, that kind of tension is in the aesthetics, in the way that the camera moves and its relationship with the music. In Robinson's Garden, that tension is actually expressed in spaces. So again, I sort of mentioned at the start, we have Kumi, as played by Oto Kimiko. She is a young woman, finds this abandoned kind of factory. It's actually a mix of several factories in Tokyo, and it's obviously, by the magic of movies, it appears as a single space. There's Sakibi there, again, from GISM. So she starts her own, like a commune almost, and part of making the space her own involves painting graffiti on all the walls and stuff. There's some images here of it's a way of creating meaning. Of like, it's not just an abandoned space anymore. This is my space, sort of thing. And then this is surrounded by obviously the Tokyo metropolis, which at this time is becoming very early. We're talking early bubble era, Baburu Keiki. So it's very hyper consumerist. You're starting to get like big screens appearing on the fronts of buildings. You're getting colourful advertising media. There's, I think, the next shot here, she looks up and you just see along the Zakyo kind of buildings, just all the different ads and commercials and signs for shops and stuff. So it's kind of interesting. She's kind of emulating that, but in a DIY. So in Tokyo, you've got all this sort of colourful corporate media, and then in her space, it's kind of like colourful sort of DIY media. So it's kind of an attempt at the punk generation trying to find. It's like an analogy for placemaking. So sort of the punk generation trying to find their own space in this kind of sea of kind of rampant sort of Japanese capitalism. There's a couple of ways that you can kind of read into these spaces. So one of them is the Robinsonade. Robinsonade is a subgenre of literature that was inspired by Robinson Crusoe. So any like castaway, any shipwreck stories or stories about castaways are called Robinsonades. And so obviously, clues in the title, Robinson's Garden obviously takes a lot of influence from that. It's actually an example of what's called inverted Crusoeism, because in the novel, in the Robinson Crusoe novel, Crusoe is shipwrecked by accident. He's not there by choice, whereas inverted Crusoeism is when someone abandons society by choice and tries to start their own thing. And then you also have a Japanese scholar, Furuhata Keiko, has talked about atmospheric media, which is this kind of idea that media is so prevalent now that it's just part of our atmosphere. And obviously, we're starting to see some of this in Tokyo in the 80s. This is the Studio Outer building in Shinjuku. I was in Shinjuku just a few days ago, and it's kind of gotten worse, if anything. There's just so many screens now, and it's just like this loud cacophony of. So Nagoya seems a bit more chill, I've noticed in my brief time here. But if you go to like Shinjuku, Shibuya, parts of Akihabara, just very lots of big screen kind of media. But Robinson's Garden kind of captures the beginning of that. So now we kind of move on to Tetsuo. So Tsukamoto has an interesting background in that he started making Hachimiri when he was a teenager, 8mm films as a teenager in the 1970s. He then kind of abandoned that to start making street theatre. He had a theatre group called Kaiju Shiata. And then he also, when he graduated university, got a job for a company that made TV commercials. And so then when he returned to filmmaking, as represented here by Tetsuo the Iron Man, you can kind of see how those different experiences were then brought together as a way to make this kind of science fiction body horror film in lieu of, he didn't have the money to do these things properly, so he kind of drew on his experience, and you can kind of see there's a theatre influence in the costuming of the actors. The stop motion animation was actually, or pixelation for live action stop motion, actually kind of comes from his TV commercial work. He was kind of already starting to kind of experiment with those techniques when making TV commercials. So it's kind of a weird blend of like Jishueiga, TV commercial, theatre. Yeah, so I love Tetsuo. That was one of the reasons I kind of got into the subject was Tetsuo. Big text. Okay, so it's kind of commonly, the common reading for Tetsuo is that, you've got the salaryman here, played by Taguchi Tomorrow. Actually, no, that's Tsukamoto there, and Taguchi's somewhere down here. This is at the end, spoiler alert for the end of Tetsuo, they kind of, the two main characters kind of merge together and they turn into this big kind of cybernetic, phallic kind of thing, and then they fly down the street together at the end. So often it's kind of the common reading is that, this is people being assimilated into the modern trappings of Japan, like that. It's very much framed as a technology thing. But it's actually something that people forget, is that there's also media involved, because at one point the salaryman has like a TV set thrust on his head, so he starts to see the world through a CRT, cathode ray tube, which is the technology for TVs at the time, starting to see the world through like a mediatized lens. So now you can make the case that this is actually a kind of a personification of the intermedial process. So you have, and also you have Tsukamoto, who kind of represents the Jishueiga, and Taguchi, who represents the punk, and they kind of and so the final fusion is not necessarily an assimilation, which kind of has a negative kind of connotation. I view it in more positive terms as synthesis. So they're actually coming together, similar to intermediality. Media is synthesizing to produce new meaning, and that kind of leads us on to the final case, which is Pinocchio 964. This case requires a bit of imagination, because it's not about the film per se, but about how the film is screened. So as I mentioned earlier, this is also in Shinjuku. They shot this without permission, by the way. They just did it guerrilla style, and he just ran up the street, and everyone was just like, what the So when he wanted to screen the film, because Fukui was like a nobody in the industry, nobody knew who he was. So to get attention, he thought, well, I'll do these special screenings so he went to a mini theatre in Tokyo called the Nakano Mutashino Hall. It's not there anymore, it closed in 2004, but it was a very influential mini theatre for Jishueiga in particular. They were very supportive of Jishueiga, and they let them do all kinds of crazy screenings and stuff. So then Nakano Musashino Hall let him take in his big speaker stacks and his PA, and had these very loud Bakon Joe screenings, and the audience and so the audience kind of responded, thinking that, oh, this is kind of like it's like a live concert, even though it's a film. It has that kind of energy of a live concert. And also something Fukui did with his PA system, he would remix the audio in the middle of the screening. So he'd have a big mixing desk and he'd turn up the bass or turn up the treble, and so different scenes in the film would have he would kind of remix the film live. And so no two screenings were ever quite the same, so each one had the potential to be a little bit different. So he calls it raibukan, like live feeling. So it's not technically live, because obviously it's a film, and films have the same scenes play after each other, of course, and film is pretty much the same every time you see it. But the way it was screened, there was enough variation to kind of think, oh, actually there is kind of a sense of a live thing. He was also kind of saying that, that people used to, because the cinema had seats, but people would stand rather than sit down to sort of watch the film. So they were kind of emulating like a rock concert in a cinema space. He still is pursuing Robukan. So this is a video I shot in 2018, where he now, not so much lately, because he has cancer at the moment. He's kind of, I think he had an operation recently, so he's kind of inactive at the moment. But a few years ago, it's 2018, he started to do what's called VJing, so taking pre-selected clips from the films and kind of mashing them together re-editing them live, and then having musicians do live music accompaniment. So I'll give you just a short burst of it so you can get a sense of what it is, but then I will move on to the next one. So that's Fukui. So he uses this pad to select the clips, and so so those two guys, I think they've split up. They're a band called Apocalypso. They're kind of an electro thing. So it's kind of interesting to see how punk or DIY inspired practices are still, they're not necessarily punk anymore, but they're still permeating within. So this was in a live house in Tokyo called 20,000 Volts. So again, literally just like he hung a bed sheet down the stage, and then he brought his own projector in. He's had like I remember there was like a big stack of beer crates up to about here, and the projector was kind of teetering on the top, and that was kind of how, because obviously these live houses don't have their own film screening equipment, so he would sort of bring his own setup in, and then they just had like a fold out table and the front of the stage, and that's kind of how they did it. Very quickly, Rolling Film in Nagoya. This is part 2. So Running from Nagoya, so they were formed, I'm guessing around 1980, it's not entirely sure when that was, by members of Aichi Medical University, the Film Research Club that they had there. Most universities had like a film research club. Their activities kind of petered out in the mid-80s, because again, a lot of them went on to become like doctors and surgeons and things like that, so then their filmmaking kind of ended. I found out about this group a few years ago. I was just kind of like trawling around online, and I found references to this group, but I didn't really know very much about them. And then 2 years ago, the Underground Cinema Festival did a program that included some of the films from this group. So you had these 2 films by a filmmaker called Hasegawa Hisashi, and then Karagi Hirohisa, so Crazy Dolls, the film we're watching, and another film of his called Ranista. My usual method when I'm kind of finding out, because the question you probably have is how do you find out about this stuff? I basically try and track down filmmakers and approach, and then the ones that are still alive I approach and try to talk to them, and some are willing to talk and others not so much, depending on how they feel about their past work. But the problem with this group is that both of these filmmakers passed away. So Karagi died in 2001 and Hasegawa died in 1997, I believe. So it kind of made it difficult to think, well, my usual method now no longer works, so how do I kind of approach it? But then this festival screened some of the films, and that's a way in, so then I kind of make contact with the festival, and that's how I'm able to show you the sort of the film today. I was going to play you. This is a clip. This is the group. That's Kawaragi there. This is the other guy, Hasegawa there. I think Pichan was his sort of nickname on the group. So you can see it's actually quite an expansive group because the core group was the medical university students, but they also had theatre people. Like, so this is how Watanabe-san got involved, because Watanabe-san was a sort of local theatre, gekijo, local theatre kind of actress. So they bring all these different people together to sort of make the film. So it's a very, again, in the spirit of punk, very collaborative, everyone helping each other out. So they appeared on TV, local TV, Nagoya Chuko TV in 1981. So this is about a 3-minute clip, but it will it's not subtitled unfortunately, and also the sound kind of dips in and out, but hopefully you'll get the gist, and also it's an opportunity to see clips of some of the other films as well.
実はですね、僕は何を隠そう、このズームに皆さん中京テレビから放送しておりますけれども、8ミリ映画で撮ってもらってるんです。こちらのカメラでね、撮ってもらってるのが分かりましたでしょうか。彼らをご紹介いたします。彼らはですね、名古屋近郊の大学のですね、映画研究会、そしてまた映画が好きでたまらないという学生、会社員で作っているですね、ローリングフィルムオブ名古屋と自主映画の制作グループの集まりなんですね。今この皆さんがですね、自分たちの作った映画をですね、全国で上映しましてですね、その反応を確かめて歩いているということで、きしめんパワー名古屋は負けない合言葉にしているということなんですね。代表者の川柳さんにお話。おはようございます。自分たちの作った映画を皆さんに見てもらってこう何がしたいのか。
俺たちは反応聞きたいからね、上映してね、だから自分たちが撮った映画は俺たちのパワーあふれるやつだから、それをみんなに見てもらってその反応聞きたいと思う。
この映画ですけれども、どんなことを表現したわけで映画を作る。
俺たちがやりたいのはだからアフリカの現場行って、これでアフロビートのね、太鼓がガーンって聞こえてきて、そういうやつを、そういうパワーをね、俺たち伝えたいと思ってる。
魂のね、根底から揺さぶれる何かを、
魂の根底から揺さぶれる、そういうハートを揺さぶるやつを俺たちがやりたい。それはいろんな意味があるんだけど、だから悲しみとかね、そうなんしいろんなものを私たち伝えてると思ってから、それをみんな来てもらって、俺たちその反応を聞きたいし、俺たちも喋りたいし、だから俺たちは例えばどこへ行くにしても監督が必ずついてるし、そういうやり方が。
観客の反応を常に聞きたい。評判どうなんですか。
評判博多は良かったですよ。もう街中お祭り騒ぎになってね、
博多で、
小さい会場やったんだけどさ、お祭り騒ぎになってさ、すげえ評判良かったね。
もう一回上映するとかそういう話だ。
それはランにした、今言ってたランにしたんだけど、それをもう一遍博多でやります。
ということなんで、もうアンコールに答えてアンコールに答えてね。なるほどね。東京ではやらないの？東京ではどうなんですか？
東京ではやります。5月の2日3日、六本木のオムってところでやりますんで、ピアを参照にして見に来てください。
そうということをしっかり言っていただきましたけれどもね、とにかく全国ツアーの真っ最中だそうでございます。大体だけど皆さんこうやっていでたちなんか見たりしますとですね、かなり自分たちの自己満足的なところに陥るんじゃないかっていう感じはないですか。そんなことはないです。
そんなことないですよ。だから俺たちがやってるのが、自分たちがフィルム撮って、自分たちがまず面白くなきゃフィルムが撮れないから、まず自分たちが面白くて、これであと遊びの部分でね、もっと軽い部分でみんなにもこう楽しんでもらうっていうかさ、そういうやり方をしてるなと思ってる。
なるほどね。果たしてですね、この名古屋のパワーがどこまで通じるかということで、映画をこれから先もやっていきたいって人は、はい、いるわけです。頑張ってくださいね。いろいろ後ほどまた番組が終わりましてからお話を伺ってみたいと思います。さあ、それでは竹山さんちゃんもあります。一緒にズーム。
So yeah, so the reason they're appearing on TV is because I apologise for for what's going on there. Yeah, it's because they had Rolling Film Nagoya 8mm National Film Tour. So you saw it was in the clip this flyer that's kind of very poor image quality. So they had 4 films. You saw clips of in the segments. Kalifura Skopu. Dekisui, I guess that translates as like drowning or something like that. Run Easter, run like chaos, like chaotic Easter, I guess would be an English translation. And Ninneko Rinrin. Played various cities. Hakata, Sapporo, Osaka, Tokyo, Hamamatsu, Kanazawa. So this was kind of April, May 1981. The clip also mentions that one of the films, Ninneko Rinrin, made it into the 1981 Pia Film Festival. I mentioned Pia Film Festival earlier. 490 films were submitted that year, and only 22 were picked, and one of those was Neneka Inrin, so it's quite an achievement to get that far. Yes, there's kind of a bit of like a mugshot image there of at the bottom. The following year, 1982, the other 3 films were submitted. 1982, they had a big Francois Truffaut retrospective that year as well, because the PFM Festival would also screen foreign films as well sometimes. So the great thing about these catalogues is that normally they would list every film that was submitted. There would just be like a big directory of all the films, and it would be organised by region. So this is the Chuba region, so Nagoya and Chubu, sorry. Yeah, the Chuba region. So yeah, it includes Nagoya and the surrounding areas. So yeah, 533 films were submitted. 21 of those were from the region. So you get a sense of where the film production is taking place around the country. Obviously, Tokyo is a very high concentration. The Kansai region as well, a lot of film production. But there were 21. But then of those 21, 3 of them were rolling film and Nagoya films. So yeah, Kaleidoscope, Dekisu and Ranista. The little circle means that it passed the first round. So I think the first round, about 45 or 46 films made it through. So basically all the films get submitted. There's a big, I think it's usually the staff of the magazine will then pick ones that they like. They'll create a short list, and then the judges are usually like celebrity filmmakers, like big name directors and stuff. So yeah, Dekisu didn't make the cut, but these 2 passed the first round, but they didn't make it into the second round. Another interesting thing about this particular pamphlet was that it's a multi-page article, which is basically a transcript of the judges discussing the films that they want to pick and not pick. And Ranista comes up quite a lot. It was kind of quite a controversial pick. So in this area here, Oshima Nagisa, very very famous director. I can't even begin to list the films he's done. He's done so many classics or Japanese films. Yeah, he didn't like the film. He didn't like the film at all. He considered it a waibatsu, vulgar. It seems, and I was talking to Machiko about this. It seemed a little rich because a few years ago, Oshima did a film called In the Realm of the Senses, Ai no Corrida, which features like real sex. And I should mention, Ranista has, there's some sexually explicit images. There's the image of like a vagina, and I think there's a scene at the end of the film where that kind of crazy monk character sort of tears the womb out of the woman that's strung up in the tree, and then starts to pleasure himself with said womb. So it's a very it's a very kind of that's a thing that happens. So so you can sort of see why like Oshima would sort of take issue with that. But then also with Ai no Corrida, you think, well, he had like real sex in that film, and because that was a film that kind of got censored in Japan for its release, because you're not allowed to show like genitals and things in Japanese film usually. And also he'd gotten in trouble because there was a book, like a screenplay photo book that got published, and that did get into trouble because that wasn't censored, and he was embroiled in a legal case for several years over that because his name was on the cover of the book. So you think he would sort of at least be a bit more sympathetic, but then he does actually kind of substantiate what he means. So the thing he dislikes, it's not necessarily the waibatsu per se, but the fact that he felt that it was manufactured. And that kind of got me thinking about punk films. Although Ranista, it's not really about punk in terms of subject, but then it kind of reminded me, there's a scholar called Stacey Thompson who's sort of written about punk cinema and what punk cinema is and what it is and isn't and that sort of thing. So he kind of says, it seems logical to assume that punk cinema's aesthetics would parallel that of punk rocks, in which case we might expect punk films to be fast-paced, elliptically edited, and calculated to offend bourgeois notions of taste and morality. So the fact that it's kind of like a calculated waibatsu, it's calculated vulgarity, it's sort of an interesting sort of link there in a film like that, and how that can sort of, even though it's not necessarily about punk in the subject matter, it kind of speaks to punk in a lot of ways. So then some broader questions then. It's got me thinking, because this is new research for me, this Ron from Nagoya, is what are the limits of punk cinema, and like what is the line between punk cinema and other forms of like alternative and transgressive modes of filmmaking? Because there's other kinds of alternative filmmaking I wouldn't necessarily want to just tar with the brush of punk. You know, there's stuff that has its own identity. So this leads us on finally to Crazy Dolls, the moment you've been waiting for. So just a little bit of context before we start. Production began in so obviously that criticism didn't deter Kararagi. He was like, I'm going to screw that guy, I'm going to make another film. And so the film is Crazy Dolls. Production began in November 1982. Cast includes theatre actors, including Watanabe-san, bands from the Star Club, Boxy Doll, a Buto dance group called Byakusha. So you'll see them in the film. The original idea of the film was punks being like caught and lobotomized by the government. I think that was meant to be the original story, but Kararagi kept adding more stories to the film and kept shooting more and more and more, and wanted to bring in other groups, other, I guess, social undesirables that would be lobotomized and things like that. Shooting locations include Electric Ladyland, the Nanatsudera corporate studio, which is kind of like a theatre space in Osu. Sort of around very close to Electric Ladyland, and also the sort of Nagoya Docklands. At the time, there were lots of abandoned buildings and things like that, so they shoot a lot there. Kararagi also was planning. He mentions it in the clip that he wanted to shoot his films in Africa as well. He didn't get to do that. He did go to Africa, I found out yesterday, but not to shoot any of the films though. And so he kept shooting and shooting and shooting, and then this expanded version just wasn't ready in time for the screening that was scheduled to take place. So he then presented a trailer of the long film, and the trailer is what we're now going to I will need to bring up the clip. Let me just okay. Yes, still loaded. Good. Yeah, something I should say is running out of time. Very poor quality image. It's basically a rip of a VHS of the film, because Kararagi came from a very respected family, and they didn't like him making these kinds of films. So then, when he died in 2001, the family basically took the films away, but someone made a copy before that happened, so that's why it looks the way it does.
Say nothing, just kissing heavily. Behind them, people Tom and the dog songs. Dog side, community and the fools. I feel sideways this time I underneath my feet. Then I found the ground and climbed and climbed and climbed in the rain.
Yeah, so I think I bowed around slightly, but yeah, that was pretty much
Okay, great.
that's pretty much the end of the thing.
Presentation.
yes.
Okay, great. Well, let's give a round of applause for Mark Player and for Watanabe-san, who's here, who's in the film. So we'll give him now, in true punk fashion, we've broken all the rules, and there may be another class trying to throw us out here a little bit. But I think we could try to squeeze in some time for a question or two. Does anyone have a question for